All right, I think this is working. So that was network scanning. Now let's talk about vulnerability scanning. Things we might do. Doing these defensively is a really good idea. Going through and looking at the systems on your own network, looking for vulns, always nice. Hopefully you'll know about vulnerability analyzers and then how to use them a little bit. We'll even make a lab where that's a requirement. That'll make it way more interesting. So these are things you should be doing on a blue team for your own network. Figuring out if there are like standards you need to hit, if you know you're subject to PCI or DSS, or if you're subject to HIPAA. Those things have information about how you need to respond to your systems, how frequently you need to go through and scan for vulnerabilities, what those scans look like, what tools you're going to use to hit those requirements. And then they're not hard. There's open source free versions out there that you can do. So you should be figuring out how to go through and scan those, review what's in there, and remediate what's in there. So go through, and if there are services on your network that are vulnerable and have patches available, go out and patch those services. And then continue monitoring that thing over the course of the life cycle of the systems on that network. So create a continuous monitoring program that is going through and figuring out what is going on your network. And I'm pretty sure I've done the top 20 from the top 20 CIS controls. With you guys, but if you're working with an organization that is a blue team, and notice like penetration testing and incident response is the last thing on this list, and they begin with things like inventory, and then step 3 here is that continuous vulnerability management that we're talking about right now. So this, after you've gone through and inventoried your hardware, after you've gone through and inventoried the software running on that hardware, your next step should be creating a program that handles this, right? Going through and scanning through your network, figuring out what vulnerabilities exist on it, and remediating them as possible. So it is like one of the very fundamental things that a network team should be, a systems team should be working on in their organization. So I mentioned regulations, for sure, things that you are going to be responsible for, right? So what regulations govern your organization? Like if you're a college, you have FERPA requirements, that the Federal Protection of Federal Education Requirements, something or other. But the things that regulate how we treat student records. If you're healthcare, you've got HIPAA to worry about. If you're a business that does credit cards, PCI DSS. If you're in the EU, you've got GDPR to keep you up at night. If you're in California, you've got whatever they're doing with their privacy laws that will probably force the rest of the country along. So what organizational requirements exist for like external stuff? And then what kind of internal corporate policies play into this? Do we have a data classification policy? Like, do we put certain things in eyes only? Are we a federal government agency that has the full-blown Bell Plata model where it's like we have top secret, secret, classified, all that kind of fun stuff? And then this is the stuff that like should be step 3 in your list of things to do for your organization. So we've made it all the way to continuous vulnerability management. Notice that pen testing is the very last thing on that list. So you've still got more work to do if that's all you've done. But for pen testing, we want to go through and figure out what it is we're going to be looking at, the assets that like we can't stand to lose. So critical assets that you maybe don't want pen testers bumping over, or if you do, you want them to at least be in a position where they can give the blue team the heads up that, hey, sorry about this, guys, we knocked something over on accident. The non-critical assets that maybe aren't such a big deal, and then Are we doing all systems, or are we specifically looking at stuff? So again, talking about what is inside and outside of scope. So if you're a federal agency, you've got FISMA requirements, the Federal Information Systems Management Act. So anybody who is a federal agency, and usually more important around these here parts, is if you are a contractor who works with a federal agency, these apply. And so you need to be scanning for vulnerabilities and systems, blah, blah, blah. You need to be able to automate your scanning, check for vulnerabilities. You ideally should have some checklists that you work for. You should be cranking out results. You should be remediating vulnerabilities and then sharing information in those scans to help other folks. So like those are if you're a federal organization. If you're a credit card accepting organization, it's kind of like the Pen Tester Employment Act of 2020. You've got to do a Wi-Fi analyzer to go out and look for Wi-Fi access points quarterly, or have a WISP or a WIDS to identify all the Wi-Fi devices. You've got to do quarterly external vulnerability scans, and a approved scanning vendor must be employed to do that. Internal scans must be done by qualified personnel. So I mean, they've got some pretty sticky requirements, and this is just if you take credit cards, which is most businesses that do any kind of business with the general public. So certainly retail, but a lot of other services too. At least once a year, do internal and external pen testing. Talk about your Penetration Tester Employment Act once a year, and after any significant infrastructure or software change, network level and application level. Thanks, PCI DSS, for keeping us employed. You must have a IDS, an intrusion detection and intrusion prevention system that looks at all traffic that handles card data. And then you need integrity monitoring for critical systems configuration and data files. Basically, you need to have a tool running to make sure if something changes that you intended to have it change. So just those two major compliance pieces, I mean, kind of help make sure that there is a job opportunities out there for pen testing teams. So the blue team needs to understand what their risk appetite is. How much risk are they willing to accept? If there is a vulnerability scan, turns up a vulnerability that is like a 5 out of 10 score that maybe could sometimes possibly allow for remote code execution, are we willing to put up with that? Is something that's just an escalation of privilege? Is that something we need to be aware of, or is that something that definitely needs remediation, even if that potentially puts a system in danger? So you figured out your risk appetite. Then that may actually come after figuring out what regulatory compliance you need to be concerned with. Figure out if there's any technical problems that will keep you from doing what it is you want to do. Figure out when you do your scanning and vulnerability assessment, how is that going to impact the organization? If you're really feeling salty, run unscheduled scans, including scheduled scans. I suppose you could have systems that people took offline during scheduled scans to try to hide from the security team. So it might be worth running them at weird hours or at unannounced times. Hopefully you're not in an organization that's doing that to you. But I mean, I could see how that would happen. And then remember that continuous monitoring and vulnerability scanning, similar but not the same. So as you go to get ready for this, figure out where that scanner needs to live relative to the networks and targets that it's going to be working with. Since that's going to happen over and over again, that system probably should live there. You know, if you're talking about constantly scanning for vulnerabilities, not only do you need to put it somewhere on the network that's useful, you also need to make sure that it can go out and update, you know, the latest signatures for the various things it's scanning for. If you have a SCAP compliant vulnerability scan, you can use SCAP, the Secure Content Automation Protocol, to get vulnerability information out from the internet and into your configuration databases. So a a convenient list of all the vulns that are out there that we know about, what you're scanning and how you're scanning it, and then make sure that you have necessary permissions. So if you start scanning other folks' networks for vulnerabilities, it's a good way to wind up in jail. And if you start scanning the systems on your network for vulnerabilities and your employer doesn't sanction that, it's a good way to wind up unemployed. So being fired and being imprisoned, both of which are not ideal. Make sure you've got the right permissions, both from the employer and then from the legal side of things too. So most of the scanners you use let you configure different types of scans, like how deep they are, whether or not you give them credentials or not. So whether you, like a scan becomes a lot more effective if the scanning software can log into a system, you know, particularly as a root user or a user with administrative accounts, and enumerate the software. Way more effective than if you're from the outside looking in to try and figure out what's going on a network. So definitely like a more involved way of looking at what's going on. That credentials concept is also referred to as the perspective from which the scan is being done. So if you can do this scan from the perspective of the systems administrator, you have a lot more info on what the guts of the system look like. So the way to go if you're the blue team, scanning externally, just looking at what ports are open like you can do with Nmap, is not the ideal way to go. So usually you can turn that up and down. You can set them to, you know, ludicrous mode, or you can dial them back down. Potentially, the like more rigorous the scan, the more you've got the potential for slowing down a system. If it's a very aggressive scan that's using a lot of connections at once, you can chew up bandwidth. And then if you've got some kind of system that's not particularly robust, potentially a scan can, you know, overwhelm it, cause it to lock up and shut down. So we had mentioned, what, a couple slides ago here, the security content automation protocol. Those include even more acronyms, but common platform enumeration. So like, what type of systems are we talking about? Configuration. So did you leave a guest user installed with no password, or is there a root account with a commonly known password? The CVEs that are out there for different vulnerabilities that exist in the software on top of that. So in addition to knowing what kind of system we're talking about, knowing how it should properly be configured, are there any vulns in the stuff that we're currently running? What score do they have? And then there is OVAL and XCCDF for creating checklists for what should be done for those configurations. And another thing our friends over at the CIS do is, in addition to providing these handy dandy tools and controls, they also provide you with cybersecurity best practices, checklists for what things you should be doing for various benchmarks on various systems. More than 100 configuration guidelines. So as you're going through and talking to your operators about, you know, this is the stuff we found on your network, the benchmark PDFs can be the kind of thing you would hand over and say, look, had you gone through and done the things outlined in this system, and I think I have a login for CIS, had you done the things that, you know, are on this list, we would not be talking to you right now about this vulnerability we found. Oh, really? Guys, don't look. I'm going to show you my CIS password. Now you know. So anybody who goes in now has a login to CIS. Oh, jeez. You guys.
Isn't that everybody on the YouTube videos as well?
Oh yeah, all those folks, you now know my current password and my new password. Go ahead and try and log into my CIS account. Actually, it wanted even more characters. So that was just not enough. I needed at least 14. which is great because the last site I tried to log into apparently needed more than 14. Oh, yeah. All right, I have to get back to that later. So ideally, at the end of all this, you can produce for your, your executive type some kind of report that will make sense to them, that is readable, that is straightforward, to kind of pass off to like up the ladder. And then laterally, we should be able to create a report for technical folks that says, here's the threat for each of these things, get to fixing, right? Like, this is the patch for this Microsoft vulnerability we found, this is the patch for that. As we go along and we create the next one and the next one and the next one, we can start producing change reports that say, hey, great job, guys, you managed to fix this, this, and this, and this. You can come up with trends that say, all of the software over at this place isn't getting patched as regularly as we might like. And then ideally, like if you buy one of the scanners you pay for, or one of the scanners that's like freemium, you probably can get this to be automated on a regular basis and then pop out reports after X amount of time automatically. So like Monday morning, the boss gets a report that's the sort of the executive summary, and the IT department gets a, here are the vulnerabilities we found over the weekend. Please make it a priority to fix these. So what kind of tools are we going to use for this? We probably want to use a vulnerability analyzer that will go through and do best practice compliance for whichever software thing you're looking for. Most of them now are aware of those regulatory compliance things, and you should be able to create a user-defined baseline for your organization that says, this is what normal looks like here. And so there's a bunch of them out there. You have a lab where I believe you're going to use OpenVAS to do vulnerability scanning. All of these are fine products that you might want to get good with. We talked about earlier, Sophia had an upcoming event where they're going to be showing you how to burp suite your way through web apps. The Zed attack proxy does much similar stuff. SQL Map, good for mapping SQL databases you may have hacked into. Nikto is another fast website checker. Nessus, I think, is now paid only. I could be wrong there. Microsoft's got a baseline security analyzer. So there's a lot of fine tools out there available for those sorts of things. We've got a host assessment that you can try out as well. And that's like scanners from the high level. You should go and play with one. All right, is everybody awake, ready for a pop quiz? Those two things aren't necessarily the same thing, but all right, your manager wants you to plan a vulnerability scanning program using an agent-based credential scanning. Agent-based credential scanning. What does that likely mean compared to the alternatives? What do you think the best response here is? The first one's got a typo in it. Can't be right. I might have made that typo goofing around. It will be easy to set up and generate lots of reports. Agent-based credentialed scanning. It will be easy to set up and maintain, generate little network traffic, and find vulnerabilities. It'll be hard to set up and maintain, but generate little network traffic and find many vulnerabilities. It'll be hard to set up and maintain and generate. So,
I'm thinking the first two we can probably cross out.
easy to set up? You don't think so?
Yeah.
All right, so A and B are gone.
It's C.
How'd you figure that out?
You clicked the button.
I did. I clicked the wrong button. How about we have a SCAP compliant vuln feed, which features a long list of vulnerabilities. Which component should be used to identify the vulnerabilities? To find, say, common vulnerabilities.
C?
Yeah, CVEs. You're performing a vulnerability scan on a network with fragile systems and limited bandwidth. What options should you choose so you don't cause any service disruption? Compliance scan, dynamic analysis, query throttling, or stealth scan. I think this is just like knowing the vocab words.
Yeah, is this one also C? It seems like it's a trick question to get 3 C's in a row.
We just decided they would all be C's. All right, how about this one? Promise, maybe it's C. After running a vulnerability scan, you learn a number of identified vulnerabilities don't actually exist on the system. What should you do? Mark them as false positives, false negatives, mark them as low criticality, or find them on an SLA.
A.
Yep. Which of the following tools would be most appropriate to perform a vulnerability scan on a web application? And
Is it D?
It is. I just glossed over that super fast. Yeah, NictoSaint and Nessus, all network scans. You're performing a white box pen test against a network running several web apps. You have vulnerability scan results for host server software and web app software, but not for the underlying database servers holding the target data. Which of the following would you likely need to map the underlying data that lives on some, oh, is that D? All right.